The automatic doors of the prestigious hospital opened smoothly, revealing a world that had always seemed distant to Natalie. The nurse, a 28-year-old black woman with a serene smile and eyes full of hope, took a deep breath before taking her first steps into that place. She had fought hard to get there, overcoming barriers that many couldn't even imagine. That hospital was the peak of the mountain she had longed to climb. The activity in the wards was intense, with doctors and nurses rushing around, ready to handle the endless emergencies. Despite the commotion, Natalie felt a deep sense of pride. Her white coat symbolized the result of her dedication. When introduced to the team, she felt the weight of their stares, as if each gaze pressed down on her skin. Still, she kept her head held high, determined to focus on her work. "Welcome, Natalie," said the head nurse, a woman with a firm voice but a neutral expression. "You'll be assigned to the morning shift. Dr. Williams is in charge of the surgical ward. He's demanding, but he's the best we have. I hope you're prepared." Natalie nodded, although she felt a slight discomfort at hearing the doctor's name. She had already heard about his reputation, and it wasn't just for his surgical skills. As she made her way to the locker room, a few team members greeted her briefly, but there was something in their tone, a cold distance. She ignored it, focusing on the fact that she was there to do what she loved, taking care of people. However, the feeling of being watched as someone who didn't belong stayed with her throughout the day. Later, when she entered the surgical ward, she finally met Dr. Williams. He was tall, with graying hair, and a look of superiority that assessed her from head to toe. His eyes did not hide his disapproval, and his greeting was brief, almost imperceptible. "I hope you know how to follow orders and don't get in the way," he said bluntly. Natalie felt the weight of those words but chose not to react. She knew she would need to prove her competence, just as she had in other places. She focused on her patients, performing her duties, and easing their pain while trying to push away the growing discomfort. But by the end of the first shift, a bitter truth began to form within her: the road ahead would not be easy. The days at the hospital passed like a silent marathon for Natalie. Each shift was a test of patience, but also of emotional endurance. The atmosphere around her began to change in almost imperceptible ways, but she noticed. Greetings, which had once been vague and cold, started to disappear. Small gestures of respect, like holding the door or sharing equipment, seemed to be intentionally withheld. Dr. Williams was at the forefront of this change. His comments, which were subtle at first, now became increasingly direct. In one of the team meetings, he did not hesitate to interrupt Natalie just as she was about to present a report on a patient. "I don't think it's necessary for you to speak. I'm sure someone with more experience can handle this appropriately," the doctor said, his tone laced with disdain, as some colleagues exchanged knowing glances. Natalie swallowed hard, feeling her blood boil inside. She knew that more experience wasn't the real reason behind the comment. But in front of everyone, she felt small, reduced to what he and many others saw: a black woman trying to occupy a space they believed didn't belong to her. The humiliations continued, some subtle, others blatant. During a routine surgery, instead of instructing Natalie, Dr. Williams completely ignored her, addressing only the other members of the team as if she were invisible. He even made jokes that, at first glance, might have seemed harmless, but Natalie knew they were filled with venom. "You should consider other areas of medicine, something more simple, perhaps. It doesn't seem like this is your place," he said at one point, smiling at the other doctors, who laughed along, despite the tension in the air. Each laugh, each malicious comment, was a dagger slowly driving into her confidence. Natalie returned home every night bearing the weight of all these small aggressions. The dark circles under her eyes began to appear, not from the work itself, but from the constant emotional toll of having to prove herself, of trying to keep her head high in an environment that insisted on bringing her down. She reflected, alone in her cramped apartment, on how much she had fought to get there. The hospital, which once symbolized a dream realized, now felt like a prison of judging eyes and poisoned words. There was a storm within her, a mix of pain and anger, but also a growing determination. She knew that giving up would be easy, but something deep inside screamed that she wouldn't yield. Still, with each shift, the feeling of isolation only grew. The few colleagues who had initially been cordial began to follow Dr. Williams' lead. Conversations would halt when she entered the room, and she often found herself eating lunch alone. Her efforts to ignore the prejudice and focus on her work were becoming unsustainable. The humiliations and prejudice were piling up, but for Natalie, quitting was not an option. Even though the environment around her was saturated with discrimination, she would keep fighting. She just didn't know how much longer she could endure. The emergency ward was bustling that morning. A new patient had just been admitted, someone important. The news spread quickly through the halls, a federal judge was among them. Natalie was called to assist, despite knowing that Dr. Williams would also be present. She mentally prepared herself, ready for another day of judgmental stares and sharp remarks. When she entered the room, she found the judge sitting on the bed, still recovering from surgery. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a commanding presence. Even in a hospital, there was something about the way he observed the room that conveyed his sense of authority. Natalie noticed that he looked at her differently, not with the judgment she was used to, but with curiosity and respect. She began the routine procedures, checking his vitals and administering medications. With every movement, she could feel the judge's attentive gaze. He said nothing at first, but the way he studied her was intriguing. Deep down, Natalie braced herself for the moment he would say something like what she had heard from so many others. "You look tired," the judge finally said, breaking the silence. Natalie, surprised by the observation, forced a polite smile. "It's part of the job, sir. We're always on the move here." The judge chuckled lightly, but his expression soon turned serious again. "I'm not talking about physical exhaustion. You seem to be carrying something heavier." Natalie hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. No patient had ever made a comment like that before. She was used to being ignored or treated as inferior, but his tone was different, almost as if he could see beyond the surface. Before she could answer, Dr. Williams entered the room, as abrupt as always, cutting off their interaction. His gaze fell on Natalie with the usual disdain. He began speaking to the judge, completely ignoring her presence, as if she were a shadow in the room. "We're closely monitoring your progress, Your Honor," the doctor said, forcing a smile. "The recovery is on track, but I recommend complete rest." Natalie, still finishing up her notes on the chart, felt the sharp gaze of the doctor on her. "Natalie, leave the report with someone more familiar with the procedures. You may go." She bit her tongue to keep from responding, controlling the anger rising inside her. She was about to leave when the judge spoke again, this time firmly, with an authority that filled the room. She is more than qualified to handle this. I want Nurse Natalie to continue assisting me. I'd rather be treated by someone who genuinely cares about the patient." Silence filled the room. Dr. Williams seemed taken aback for the first time. His forced smile disappeared, replaced by a look of restrained fury. He hesitated for a moment but, with no choice, nodded and left without saying another word. Natalie was surprised by the judge's intervention. No one had ever stood up for her like that, especially against Dr. Williams himself. She looked at the judge, who now gazed at her with understanding. "I know what you're going through," he said calmly. "I've seen this many times in my career. People like Dr. Williams think they can treat others as inferior because of their skin color or position. But you don't have to accept that." His words struck Natalie deeply. For the first time, she felt that someone was willing to see what was really happening, the injustice she faced daily. She smiled, a genuine smile, and silently thanked him for that small victory, even if only for a moment. As the days passed, the judge became a regular presence in her routine. They spoke briefly during procedures, and Natalie learned that he was a man of strong principles, someone who believed in justice above all else. He made a point of praising her work, boosting her confidence, something she felt had been slipping away. There was still a long road ahead, but in that moment, Natalie felt that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone in this fight. The hospital was in its typical morning rush. Nurses and doctors ran back and forth, attending to emergencies and caring for patients. But for Natalie, that day felt particularly tense. Something was in the air. She didn't know if it was just another one of those invisible pressures that surrounded her daily or if something was truly about to happen. In the surgical ward, Natalie was called to assist in a complicated procedure. Dr. Williams was leading, as always, commanding the team with his authoritarian tone. She was used to his oppressive presence, but that day he seemed especially irritated. Perhaps it was the accumulated weight of seeing the judge prefer her company, or maybe it was the bruised ego of being contradicted. "Prepare everything, Natalie," he said, his tone more of an order than an instruction. Natalie performed her duties with her usual efficiency, staying focused on the patient and ignoring the disdainful looks the doctor cast her way. But then, something changed. In the middle of the procedure, there was a minor slip. A clamp wasn't positioned exactly where it should be. It was a small mistake, something that could easily be corrected. However, for Dr. Williams, that was the last straw. "You are completely incompetent," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "How do you think you can work in a hospital like this? People like you should be cleaning the floors, not inside a surgery room." Silence filled the room. Everyone present stopped, shocked by the violence of his words. Natalie felt her face burn with shame and anger. She knew that when he said, "people like you," he was referring to her race, that those words carried all the veiled racism she had endured for far too long. She tried to hold back the tears threatening to fall. She wanted to respond, but her throat was tight. She felt small, humiliated in front of everyone, as if each one silently agreed with what he said. But at that moment, the operating room door opened. The judge, who was in recovery and needed assistance, entered accompanied by a nurse. He had heard enough to understand what was happening. Dr. Williams, his voice was firm and authoritative, cutting through the heavy atmosphere. "I suggest you choose your words more carefully. The doctor turned, surprised by the interruption, but quickly tried to recover. "Judge, this is a medical environment. You can't just interrupt." "Interrupt?" The judge cut him off again. "What can't happen here is racism. What I just heard is unacceptable. Nurse Natalie is more than qualified to be here, and no one, absolutely no one, has the right to treat her that way." The room fell silent again. Dr. Williams, visibly nervous, tried to maintain his composure, but the impact of the judge's words was undeniable. "You don't know who you're talking to. This is ridiculous. I run this ward, and she's a novice who can't even do her job properly." The judge took a step forward, his presence growing even more imposing. "I know exactly who I'm talking to. And I know enough about the law to ensure that what you've just done will be punished. You've just committed the crime of racial slander, and this will not go unpunished." Natalie, still stunned by the situation, felt a wave of relief and surprise. She had never imagined that someone would have the courage to confront Dr. Williams like that. The judge, with his authority and conviction, was challenging a system that had always oppressed her, and she was no longer alone. Dr. Williams tried to pull himself together, but it was too late. "You're overreacting," he muttered, his voice weakened by the realization that he had lost control of the situation. The judge looked at one of the nurses in the room, a young man who seemed torn between loyalty to his boss and doing what was right. "Please, call the police. We're going to treat this as the serious matter it is." The atmosphere grew even more tense, but the decision had been made. The medical team, who had previously watched in silence, now began to murmur. The presence of the judge had changed everything. Slowly, witnesses started to speak up. Other voices began to rise, recounting incidents of racism and abuse of power that Dr. Williams had committed over the years. The police arrived at the hospital quickly. The presence of a federal judge reporting a case of racial slander sped up the process, and the atmosphere was tense as the officers entered the surgical ward. Dr. Williams, still trying to maintain his composure, was immediately questioned about the incident. His once arrogant demeanor now seemed shaken, but he still attempted to justify his actions, as if it were all just a misunderstanding. "This is all an overreaction," he said, forcing a calm tone. "I never intended to insult her. These accusations are absurd." But the judge, standing firmly by Natalie's side the entire time, responded, "Racial slander is a crime, doctor. Your words were clear, and the testimony of those present only reinforces what everyone here saw and heard." Natalie, still processing the events, felt the weight of the moment. Part of her still feared retaliation, wondering if this was truly the right path. But as she saw the support starting to emerge around her, that doubt slowly began to fade. Nurses and colleagues who had always remained silent now looked at her with respect, as if they finally saw what she had always tried to prove, that she deserved to be there. The conversation between Dr. Williams and the police continued, but the situation was clear. He would be taken in for questioning, and the officers had already gathered enough statements to know this wasn't an isolated incident. Other professionals began to report their own experiences with the doctor, revealing a history of abuse of power and prejudice that had until now remained hidden. The doctor's mask of respectability was falling before everyone's eyes. As Dr. Williams was escorted out of the hospital by the police, Natalie felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, there was relief. For the first time, someone would be held accountable for the prejudice she and so many others had faced in silence. On the other hand, there was deep sadness. How could this have happened in a place where life should be the priority? How could a doctor, someone sworn to care for all, carry so much hate in his heart? The judge, sensing Natalie's internal conflict, approached her. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice calm but firm. "People need to know that we're not alone in this fight. Justice begins when we have the courage to speak up." She looked at him, grateful but still in disbelief at everything that had happened. "I never imagined anyone would stand up for me. I always felt alone here, powerless." The judge gave her a slight smile. "That's how they want you to feel. But the truth is, when we take a step forward, we inspire others to do the same. Fear loses its grip when we confront injustice head-on." News of the incident spread quickly through the hospital, and the impact was immediate. The administration, pressured by the gravity of the situation, launched an internal investigation, promising severe measures to ensure cases like Natalie's would never happen again. Word traveled through the halls, sparking a wave of reactions. For some, it was the beginning of a necessary change. For others, it was a warning that discriminatory and abusive behavior would no longer be tolerated. In the days that followed, Natalie noticed a shift in the atmosphere around her. Racism still existed, that was clear, but something had changed. She was no longer seen as a solitary figure fighting against the system. There was a new understanding, a new respect for her and what she had endured. Many of her colleagues quietly began to support her, and others, previously silent, now saw her as a symbol of resilience. But more important than the recognition from others was the change that occurred within her. For the first time, Natalie felt that her voice had power. She had faced racism, prejudice, and injustice head-on, and in doing so, she found a strength she didn't know she had. And as she reflected on everything that had happened, she knew that this victory was just the beginning. The fight for equality and respect was still long, but now she was ready to face it. Not just for herself, but for all those who, like her, suffer in silence. The difference now was that she had learned to speak up, and she wouldn't stop anymore. The days following Dr. Williams' arrest brought a new dynamic to the hospital. The complicit silence that had reigned in the hallways had been shattered. Natalie continued her work with the same dedication as always, but something had changed. She walked with her head held high, aware that she was no longer alone and that she had indeed opened the door to a new phase in her life and the lives of others. The internal investigation into the doctor's behavior revealed a disturbing history of abuse that had been ignored for years. Other staff members, inspired by Natalie's courage, began to report similar situations. The hospital had no choice but to permanently remove Dr. Williams from his duties, and he would face the consequences of his actions in court. Despite this, the fight against racism in the hospital was far from over. Natalie knew she had planted a seed, but the soil still required a lot of cultivation. She had become an active voice within the institution, and the administration began implementing stricter anti-discrimination policies, along with promoting training to raise awareness among the entire staff about respect and inclusion. A month after the events, Natalie's life took unexpected turns. The judge who had defended her honor continued his recovery, and over the days, he and Natalie developed a friendship based on mutual respect. He encouraged her to keep using her voice and her courage to fight for the causes she believed in. "You are not just a nurse, Natalie. "You are a leader," the judge said during one of his visits. "People like you change the world." Those words echoed in her mind for days. Natalie had always believed her role at the hospital was simply to care for patients and go about her life. But for the first time, she began to see that she could do more. She could be an agent of change, not just within the hospital, but in society as a whole. It was then that she made a decision that would change the course of her life. In a meeting with the administration, Natalie proposed a training program focused on education about racism and inclusion, not only for hospital staff but also for the entire public health network in the city. She knew that change needed to be broader, that it needed to reach more people, and now she was ready to lead that transformation. The proposal was met with enthusiasm. Her courage and determination, which had once been just a quiet spark, had now become a fire that lit the way for others. At the hospital, Natalie became an example of strength and resilience. Her colleagues respected and admired her not just for the professional she was, but for being the woman who had the courage to confront injustice head-on. Things would never be the same there, and she knew she had been a part of that change. Months passed. Natalie was now a reference not just in her hospital, but throughout the city. The inclusion project she created expanded, reaching other institutions and inspiring other women and men to fight against prejudice, discrimination, and racism in all areas of society. The judge, who had been the catalyst for her transformation, had returned to his normal life, but they kept in frequent contact. The friendship between them flourished, and Natalie always remembered his words whenever she felt uncertain. "You are a leader." One morning, upon arriving at the hospital, she was called to the director's office. There was an invitation for her to participate in a conference on diversity and inclusion in the healthcare sector. Natalie accepted with pride, knowing that her journey was just beginning. The hospital, which had once been the stage of her greatest humiliations, had become the place where she found her strength. And now, Natalie was ready to spread that strength to the world. Her past of pain and racism would no longer be her burden, it would be the foundation of her journey to build a more just future. She was no longer just a nurse. She was a voice. A leader. And no one could silence her ever again.
Thank you for following us this far. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories.